So welcome to Recession Rebellion. This begins week 7. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate all the support. Wanted to shout out to Sean Donnelly because he did an absolutely fantastic shout out to us on LinkedIn yesterday. As ever, the feedback and the support that we get from all of you means a lot because it pushes us on to keep helping you. So it's a lovely circle of helpfulness. My name is Martin Lucas. I run a business called Gap in the Matrix. So we spent 4 years decoding and hacking decision making so that we can help you understand your customers, so that generally what we work on is growth of sales, marketing, or in today's world, we're picking up a lot of customers for revenue protection. Could you please give us an introduction, Phil?
I'm Phil. I run a business called Corporate Punk, and we help other businesses continue to adapt to the ever-changing world in which we seem to be living.
And Phil's going to be running today's session as ever, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Phil. What are we going to be talking about today?
Today, Martin, we're going to be talking about speed. So, but not in the amphetamines, not the amphetamines type. We're just going to talk about speed in business in general, actually. And those of you who've tuned in to hear me talk over the last few weeks will know I've been talking a lot about the idea of now. The time is now. We need to be moving now. We need to be getting on with our strategic planning. And I want to talk to you a little bit about where we're at now today, but also what's going to happen next. So, and by next, I mean, not getting into some tendentious future of work style nonsense, but actually getting into something which is, there are some shifts going on at the moment that I think we need to be aware of as we're thinking through our businesses. And there are some shifts going on at the moment that we need to try and echo in our own businesses. And as we start thinking through what we need to do now, we need to be thinking through what we need to do now, mindful of some of these shifts, basically. So in that context, I want to talk to you about high-speed change today. So why high-speed change is here to stay and what that means for you. And at the end of this webinar, I want to talk to you about something we're launching next Tuesday. I want to tell you that we're launching something next Tuesday. And really, I want you to think about what we're talking about today as a kind of transition into where my Tuesday sessions are going to go from this time next week. More on that later on. So high-speed change is our theme, why it's here to stay and what that means for you, what it means for us all, actually, in effect. So as always, let's start with what's going on. So all around us, we're seeing monoliths moving at the speed of light at the moment, which is really genuinely really fascinating, actually. A guy interviewed in the Times, one of the senior leaders of the NHS recently, said that they've done, in terms of adoptions of new technology, the NHS had done more in 2.5 weeks than it had accomplished in the preceding 20 years, right? Absolutely fascinating that a business or an organisation can move that quickly. Another example, I was on the phone yesterday to someone who is very senior at HSBC, and they were saying that in general, to launch a brand new product, to test it and to get it ready to roll takes about 7 months. And all of the banks have managed to make extraordinary progress on things like the bounce back loan scheme and the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme in about 7 days. If you look at food, if you saw my Forbes column on this a week or two ago, I wrote about Leon. Leon has spent 2 or 3 years slowly developing its e-commerce capabilities, only then to have to launch a direct-to-consumer e-commerce business in 3 weeks. So what you're seeing is this kind of shift where businesses that have taken years or months to do something are now getting things done in days and weeks. Now look, needs must, right? Which is the obvious explanation. So we're all capable of moving faster and further than we imagine, especially when circumstances compel us to do it. So, it's the age-old thing, isn't it? If I gave you 5 hours to chop down a tree, you'd spend the first 4 working out how to sharpen the axe. It's kind of that axiom in practice, I suppose. So we can move further and faster than we ever thought possible when we're compelled to do so by circumstances. It's a bit like anxiety is a luxury. Do you know what I mean? The worrying about doing things is a luxury. Sometimes the way the world works is we just need to get on, and this is what we're seeing happening around us at the moment. But here's the interesting thing as well. Some of those organisations, and this is certainly true in financial services in terms of some of the banks and especially some of the fintechs, and it's certainly true in food as well, that And the ability to be responsive is a competitive advantage. If, in the worst case scenario, if these businesses hadn't moved as quickly as they have moved, they may not actually have survived, or they certainly may not have fulfilled their obligations to their, what you might call, stakeholders or audiences. But in many cases, the moves that we're seeing these businesses make very, very quickly are actually helping them to establish clear blue water between themselves and the rest of the competition. So in the case of fast food, a direct-to-consumer delivery business isn't here just for 3 weeks, it's here for years. And it's now a competitive advantage that the business that built it can move on. In the case of the banks, if they weren't able to move around that, those loan schemes in the very, very short period of time that they moved on them, we'd be in a position where actually over, politically speaking, the energy, it would have been disastrous for the big banks, and the energy will move more towards the fintechs. They have to maintain competitive advantage by moving quickly. And so smart leaders, and as I said in a LinkedIn post, a video I put up on Friday, we work with brilliant leaders at Corporate Punk, really some of the best in the world. And smart leaders, realizing their organizations can work fast, will not want to see them revert to go slow. So this is the thing. Now look, I really, really don't like the words new normal. It's one of those awful sort of pat expressions. We're seeing quite a lot of that at the moment. We're seeing unprecedented times, right? Which I'm sure I've ranted on about in a preceding webinar to this one. But we are seeing, this idea that actually, if we can deliver change in weeks and days, why historically has it taken us months and years? And you could look at it in a different way. If we've seen change can be delivered by a fairly small number of people working together in the right ways, why has it taken, vast teams to do this in the past, kind of thing? So there's a kind of speed and agility point here, and also actually just are we running as we need to point here. So the critical thing is leaders have kind of looked at this and looking at this and going, there's lessons in here about the pace at which this organisation can actually work. We force it to do so. And also don't forget, given the downwards pressure that there's going to be on the economy, leaders have an incentive to get stuff done quicker than ever before as well. So taking that into account, you really get to a view which says high-speed work, high-speed change. The norm is preferable. It's preferable to it being a norm than it being an exception. Let me say it again. So high-speed change, it is better for it to be a norm for a business than it is to be an exception for a business. Now, this poses real challenges for a lot of leaders. Because, and we're seeing this with some clients as well at the moment. We're seeing it certainly with other organisations we have, non-client organisations we have contact with, that there's this sense a lot of the time amongst teams that, okay, we're going to get this product shipped really fast. We're going to get this piece of work done really fast. And then there's going to be a kind of reversion to the mean. There's going to be we're going to start being able to go slow again. This kind of burst of activity that we've just experienced, it's the exception rather than the rule. Because within the culture, high speed has not been codified as a kind of expected state. So the job for leaders is to work through, and the job for all of us is to work through, how do we make sure that we have the highest possible pace and speed of change in our companies? How do we normalize that within our culture? Is really the question that leaders need to be asking. And those of us who are working with leaders need to help them answer this question, or indeed just point them in the direction of this question if they're not thinking that way at the moment. So if we are going to move towards high speed, we have to look at a couple of speed bumps that there are in the road. The first speed bump is about how you manage individuals. So, individuals, particularly enthusiastic or passionate individuals, have a horrible habit of burning out when they work at high speed because they're enthusiastic. They want to get the job done. A lot of the time that enthusiasm can override their ability to kind of self-regulate. So enthusiastic people can burn out if they work at too fast a pace for too long. The second is about team dynamics. Now, high speed of work quickly collapses into a sweatshop Because if you don't manage your team dynamics very well, when everyone's trying to get stuff done really quickly, presence becomes a proxy for productivity. So, the issue with that is that, it's the showing up, is the actual doing of the job, which is just not true. And the thing about sweatshops is they look attractive for about a week. They can be quite fulfilling, kind of egoically, for leaders. And then what happens is people go, actually productivity dives because nobody can work at pace like endlessly. We'll talk about that in a second. And also morale dips because there's that kind of relentless pace of work also tends to diminish creativity, which actually means in the end people get fed up. So we have to make sure that we're managing people individually, particularly our most passionate, and we're also being really conscious of the team dynamics, so that actually productivity doesn't become replaced by presenteeism in effect. So those are speed bumps, the two major speed bumps we need to be aware of. So if we're trying to normalize high speed in our culture rather than have it sit as the exception, and we've got the speed bumps, what are the things that we need to do? So making high-speed work the norm. So the first thing is the foundations. I always like to use these structures, keep it the same. But the foundations are, firstly, let's have open discussions about this with our teams. Let's make sure that our teams, the people that we're working with, we can have an open conversation with them about the fact we need to be getting stuff done more quickly than ever before. Let's just kind of normalize that. We also have to get really good at understanding that high-speed work means different things to different people, right? That different people have different working patterns, different working styles. The idea of deep versus shallow work, which we'll come on to in a second, comes through here as well. Different functions need to work in different ways. So we have to have insight really around what those working patterns and styles actually are. It's not a case of getting everybody to perform as one. It's not a 100-meter run, do you know what I mean? Or 100-meter dash in that sense. We need to understand how our organisation, functions at the moment, so we can look at where the blocks to doing that work actually are. And as leaders, we need to be an explorative, enabling, and manage risk-taking mindset. So making high-speed work the norm is really about, okay, we need conversations, we need insight, we need to understand where the system might be getting gammed up, and we need to start playing with all of this. Now, there's a theme, isn't there, here? If you listen to me talk over the last few weeks, you'll see constantly this theme about exploration, testing, learning, maintaining an open mind. Because the reality is, we are in a complex, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous world here, right? We're in a world where we don't quite know what's happening day to day. We don't know what the future holds for any of us. So all we can do is kind of blind incrementalism thing I was talking about last week, kind of blindly, sort of feel our way into the future. That's what we need to do with our teams as well as with our, customer context and the sales context, So 3 things we then need to do. The first thing is shift our focus from managing time to managing energy. So if we're trying to, high speed work is about, ultimately, it's a question of energy management, energy deployment, right? Do away with timesheets might be something to think about. That actually the idea of just logging time fundamentally, and time as a sort of proxy for value, goes out of the window if we're talking about energy management, because it is about the value you bring and where that energy is vested and in what type of energy you're deploying, much more so than the time. You'll outlaw presenteeism. So wherever you see it, I think leaders particularly need to model really good behavior here, model really good behavior about high speed of work, intense work, and then out, intensely in, intensely out, as we say sometimes to leaders. Openly discuss energy levels with your people. I talked about that already. And think carefully about how you frame messages about ways of working and their outcomes. So a lot of the time, what happens is that we sort of almost unconsciously as leaders start to communicate an idea of everybody worked incredibly hard. There was a lot of late nights, guys. There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Not necessarily sending the right signal here. High speed work is actually sometimes about intensity of work and focus and making sure that the energy is going in the right direction and making sure that systemic blockers are removed, much more so than it is about late nights and blood, sweat, and tears. people can be more productive sometimes in a 2-hour working session than they can in a 12-hour working session. It's just that we have a world of work that doesn't kind of recognize that at the moment. So, got to be really thinking through. If we want to do this, we have to think through the way we frame our messages, about ways of working, about the outcomes that we get, all that kind of thing. Right? So energy, not time management, really, really important. This is why, by the way, anecdote, this is why we have spent so long at Corporate Punk working with working mums. So, you know, a lot of the people who work in and around our business, a lot of our associates are working mothers, because they kind of get this, actually. They sort of get the idea that I've got 100 things to do. I've got small children to take care of and just need to be bloody efficient, you know? So actually their energy management tends to be remarkable just by virtue of some of the pressures that they've got in their lives. If you want something doing, ask a busy person. It's all that kind of thing, right? Work in cycles. So high-speed work is fundamentally about working in cycles. So 2 ways you can think cyclically. One is about peaks and troughs, right? So actually we have times when things are a bit quieter, and then we have times when things are massively intense. And those peaks and troughs, they can be daily, they can be weekly, they can be monthly, they can actually just be occasional, which is to say that when needs arise, yeah, depending on the type of peak where it happens. That's one way of looking at it. Or deep versus shallow work is another way of thinking about cycles. Nobody can do constant deep work. If you remember the conversation we were having about deep work on remote working about 3 or 4 weeks ago, no one can do that constantly, because actually it's basically it's kind of exhausting. It's cognitively exhausting, creatively exhausting, whatever. So we need to be able to renew sometimes by doing lighter touch sort of shallow work, if you will. So a good way to think about this is where already in your business, what can you already learn about the cycles of your business? So it might be, for example, if you're in events marketing, there are natural cycles, because actually there's an events calendar. I know there isn't at the moment, but in general, there's an events calendar that happens, and that's going to dictate some of those cycles for you, right? And then review your processes in light of that. Another way of working in cycles is not to keep the same team hammering all the time on the same project. You can rotate people in and out of projects. I think one of the great innovations of furloughing, which is something I'm relatively skeptical about, as most of you will know, in some businesses. One of the great innovations of furloughing is that actually people can be rotated in and out of furlough, which I think is a great way of maintaining sort of competency, basic competencies in an organisation. It's also a great way of making sure that people feel like they have some utility to the business, which is the fundamental issue with furloughing. It's like temporary redundancy. And it's also a great way of kind of like energetically making sure that you've got people either intensely in or intensely out again. So, you know, furloughing actually offers the opportunity to do that. But even when we're out of furlough, which I think we will be in most industries at the end of June, we still have a job to do to work out how we rotate people in that projects. You know, a bit of fresh blood basically can really, really help maintain that pace. And then engaging your people in planning cyclical working. So actually making sure that you're talking to them about it. So always with us, talk about the problems you've got. Talk about the things you want to accomplish as an organisation. Talk about how you want your culture to evolve. You've got the collective brain power of your people. It's not the job of leaders to have the answers. It's the job of leaders to enable the answers to be found, right? So you can engage your people in thinking this through. And then finally, write the legends. So all cultures are built on legends. You know, narratives, stories, things we tell ourselves about what got done here and why, and what it did for us, you know. And you know, most organizations have those legends. Sometimes those legends are really negative. You know, somebody did this and then got fired is a form of legend, isn't it? But you know, we always advise leaders build positive legends. It's like write the positive stories, you know, and you've got to repeat them. Like, legends don't mean anything unless they're told and retold and retold and retold. But a good way of doing that, consider what impact high-speed change has already had. You know, what's it done for you? Making heroes of those involved. So make sure that you praise and celebrate great behavior, not presenteeism, but proper productivity. Embedding insights and lessons along the way. And you've got to keep affirming those legends through retelling. You know, we are storytellers. Really, at one level, like Jungian archetypes are about these sort of fuzzy imprinted roles we get because we all live our lives in stories. So we understand a hero, we understand an outlaw, we understand the idea of, of a voyage and a quest. All those sorts of things, they're all there, and you can build legends around them if you consciously choose to do so. So to recap, what I'm saying for all of you really at the moment is, high speed change, we're seeing it happen already, and smart leaders aren't going to let it dive because it is a source of competitive advantage. We've got to normalize high speed working now as we go forward, normalizing, making it the rule, not the exception, in how the organizations that we run and the organizations that we advise function. Yeah? We've got to make sure that actually we aren't mistaking high speed work, which is work of high productivity, for presenteeism. We've got to make sure that we're helping our people to manage their energy, make sure that we're actually not creating a sweatshop by accident or in fact by design, which is even worse. We've got to make sure then that we're continually interrogating how we can do this well, which means, again, always thinking about energy rather than time management, thinking about cyclical working. How do we bring people in? How do we take them out? How do we contrast deep work and shallow work? And how do we manage and regulate those energy patterns? And then finally, making sure that we have stories that we're telling about what high-speed work has allowed us to do, what real productivity in our organizations has allowed us to do. This is not a question that is just about the business of 6 months or the business of a year. Organizations are doing this right now, and the ones that are doing this right now are the ones that are getting and staying ahead already. It's a source of significant competitive advantage within your culture to be able to gear it to be highly productive. Very, very important point. So the one thing you should do now, check your own energy levels. Let's start by looking at ourselves. So what's going on inside? Let's check our own energy levels before we start talking about, anybody else's energy levels. If you've got low energy at the moment, right? Well, firstly, be kind to yourself. I wouldn't go into self-judgment around that, but seek to understand why. And then when you can understand why, you can fix it. And then it can be a great catalyst for a conversation with your team. So, making sure that your own energy is in a good place is a prerequisite of being able to manage the energy of others. So let's start with that. And that's it for today. I'll take questions in a second, but just to say this time next week, as I said earlier on, we will be making a fairly major announcement. I mean, it sounds very kind of epochal when I put it like that, but it's quite a big announcement for us. It's going to be a really cool thing that we're doing. So we'll talk about that next Tuesday. Also, these webinars on Tuesdays going forwards, I'm going to be organising the next few weeks around a very specific theme. So there's a new series coming. So every Tuesday we'll be examining something which is very kind of, it's a sequence we're going to start to do over the next few weeks so that everything sort of converges on a single point, which will be interesting. So if you want to bring people along next Tuesday, I think that'd be really good. So please do that. And in the meantime, Martin, any cues?
First of all, well done, Phil. It was you packed in a whole bunch of stuff like that. It's really enjoyable to listen to full stop. We've got some great questions, actually. So our first one is, high-speed operations require efficient systems, or at least the ability to think on your feet. So how can you come up with alternate on-the-go solutions? So basically, how do you get into fifth gear without compromising quality in the process?
Well, I think that you've got to check your own definition, to be honest, because we're talking about, it's a bit like on a motorway, right? We're talking about high-speed driving, not high-speed crashes, yeah? So implied in all of this is not the idea that we go so fast that quality starts to diminish, or we go so fast that we haven't got appropriate checks and balances in place around the actions that we're taking. Really, the spirit of this is we're going as fast as humanly possible, or fast as we can, but no faster is the right way to put it. Yeah. So, if you think about the banks, right, they're launching these new loan products at the moment. One of the reasons why there's already backlogs over the last 24, 48 hours, and I can speak to this with some authority, is the fact that they simply cannot, from a risk point of view, afford to put approval systems live that would compromise the integrity of their know your customer or anti-money laundering guidelines and regulations, because doing that would accrue all sorts of issues, not only for banks, but actually it would accrue all sorts of issues for the government and everything else. So it's an instructive thing, because the thing that they're having to do is sort of, on the one hand, they've got extraordinary demand coming at them, but on the other hand, they've got to hold the line to make sure that the internal systems and processes don't fall over. Now, those of us in non-regulated industries, where we're not forced to do that, would still do well to think like that. So the job really is not to sacrifice or bypass those things, but to work as quickly on them in the way that we're trying to as quickly work on the rest of it.
Yeah, cool. Okay. This is a doozy of a question, really, really good one, right? So what role does scale play in your advice, right? But put it another way, what do you think is most important to consider between working at speed in a smaller organization, so less than 100 people, versus in a large organization over 5,000 people?
What do I think is most important to consider?
Yeah.
Well, I sort of don't accept the premise that big has to mean slow. I think big can mean nimble, actually. I think if you look at say what Amazon's managed to achieve over the last few years, that's an organization that's managed to get very, very big while still remaining a degree of agility. And I think the key to that, something we talked about before on this webinar, is almost regardless of the size of business, making sure that the teams that you've got working on initiatives remain very small. So it's that thing around small teams, clarity around where the autonomy sits within those teams and within the organisation overall, and very, very clear project definitions and guardrails. And I have seen small businesses of 100 people. We worked with one last year that was simply incapable of shipping anything at all, because actually what happened was it had no proper project definition or guardrails, and actually weirdly it had such a kind of inclusive culture. It was kind of just bringing everybody to the table, and actually it ended up being massively inefficient. Whereas we've worked with some corporates in the past, and you'd be stunned by how quickly they can move when they want to, because they just understand they have got good systems in place, and they will keep the teams working on things very, very tight. So I think the principles of being able to do this kind of stuff and do it well apply regardless of the size of organisation. The only difference would be, I think, at an industry level, sometimes you've got additional considerations. So, for example, we're talking about FS on this webinar today. In financial services, you're going to have to go through a number of additional hoops than you might have to go through in other industries, just because of the various sort of compliance issues that there are and so on. But that can still be done in a nimble and agile way if the teams are kept small, the guardrails are in place, and the project definition is very, very tight.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I'll add a couple of things to that as well. We've spoken about this before. You need a good permission-based psychology within your system. It's amazing what will happen if people feel they've got a sense of permission. The other thing as well is that if you're having a meeting that's about general team meeting, then ignore this rule, right? But if you're having a meeting that's about problem solving and working on things, your team should never be bigger than 7. So we recommend 5 or 7 is your perfect number. That comes from the world of academia and our own work. And one of the biggest problems you've got with big business is that the reason why it feels more difficult to make decisions is that once you go past a 3-tiered structure, so like 10 people reporting to 10, that's 1,000 people, right? Once you go beyond that, you end up having far too many lines of communication. So the bureaucracy comes from having too much communication. So it's about having a flatline agile structure, which is what Amazon and Google do, which is what Phil was talking about. So great session today, Phil. What's in line for us tomorrow? Take us out, please.
So in line tomorrow, in line for us tomorrow, we have a lovely lady called Judy talking to us from a company called Roche Martin, and they make some very brilliant psychometric tools, particularly examining things like emotional intelligence. So Judy will be talking to us tomorrow, all the way from Australia, by the way. She's actually dialing in from Oz tomorrow to do this, which is cool in and of itself, to talk to us about resilience, but through the lens of those kind of things. So resilience through the lens of emotional intelligence and psychometrics and various other stuff. So I'm really excited about it. Her organisation's great, she's lovely, and it'll be a really, really good session tomorrow. So again, please spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Great start to the week. Thanks everybody for coming along, and we'll catch you tomorrow.